Aloha mai kako, you are watching Hawaii Political Reporter.
Our top story for this half hour, U.S. military officials confirmed that 3 servicemen killed in southern Afghanistan were American. The troopers lost their lives in a roadside bomb attack by Taliban militants in Helmand province. Friday's deaths bring to 30 the number of U.S. forces killed in Afghanistan so far this year. More than 3,400 foreign service members, most of them American, have been killed since the 2001 U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. Our correspondent Faz Khoshi joins us via satellite from the Afghan capital Kabul with more on the incident that took place in Helmand in southern Afghanistan. Faz, give us the details, please.
But it's another deadly attack on American troops here in Afghanistan. These American soldiers were patrolling in Helmand when hit by a roadside bomb. As you said, the bomb was planted by the Taliban militants. It remains the biggest killer of foreign troops in this country. It's the weapon of choice of the Taliban militants, and these roadside bombings inflicted heavy casualties on American soldiers over the past 12 years in this war-torn country. And the deaths of these 3 American soldiers have been confirmed by Pentagon in U.S. military headquarters here in Kabul. A huge blow, of course, to U.S. forces now here in Afghanistan. The U.S. military men have already expressed their concerns about growing Taliban attacks in this country. We understand that Taliban launched a massive spring offensive now here in Afghan, and American forces remain their soft targets. It's much more now Afghan forces that are being killed and wounded by the Taliban attacks, because they can be seen much more now on the front lines fighting with the Taliban militants. But yes, the U.S. forces are now carrying out their military operations by air. They have to go also by road to get their supplies from one region to other, and they are very vulnerable to roadside bombings of the Taliban militants.
Fuz, we are in the midst of the Taliban spring offensive, as you mentioned. How come year on out foreign forces haven't managed to repel this seasonal offensive by the Taliban?
Well, Taliban launch a spring offensive every year here in Afghanistan, but 2014 is a very crucial year for the Afghan people. The Afghan people went to the polls to pick their next president. The final results have not come out yet. We don't know the name of the winner of this election yet. And we understand that the drawdown has also started. Most American troops are expected to leave this country and go home by the end of this year. But let's not forget that President Obama has already announced that he wants to keep about 10,000 American troops here until 2016. And many here believe that this announcement has further angered the Taliban militants, and more such attacks should be expected. The spring offensive is, of course, now in full swing, and it's also Afghan forces that continue to launch operations against the Taliban militants across this country, and they are now taking the lead of these military operations. To the Afghan government, it's just a propaganda, but Taliban, with such attacks, especially the one that happened yesterday in Helmand, proved that they are still remain undefeated, despite the presence of a large number of American and Afghan forces.
Thank you very much, Fuz. Press TV's Faz Khoshi joining us from the Afghan capital, Kabul.
Well, militants of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, meanwhile, have seized a town on the border with Syria. Local sources say the ISIL insurgents are now in full control of the town of Al-Ghaim, as well as the main border crossing between Iraq and Syria. The gunmen captured the town following days of heavy fighting with Iraqi security forces. The takeover is forcing Ghaim residents to flee their homes. ISIL militants have overrun large swathes of land in northern Iraq, including the cities of Mosul and Tikrit, in just 2 weeks. Thousands of Iraqis have taken up arms to help the army fight the insurgents. A military parade has been held in Baghdad in solidarity with the Iraqi army that's engaged in heavy fighting with the terrorist group ISIL. The parade was called by top Iraqi cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. The cleric has urged his supporters across the country to enhance unity among the Iraqi people. Tens of thousands of volunteers have so far joined the Iraqi troops, who are engaged in a fierce battle against militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in northern and northwestern areas. Days ago, Iraq's top Shia cleric Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani called for people to join the battle and defend the country. Iraqi media say more than 2 million people have so far voiced their readiness to join the fight.
On to our next story. Anti-war activists and protesters have rallied outside the White House, voicing their opposition to any American military involvement in Iraq as the country is grappling with insurgency.
We're here today to stand in opposition to any new war in Iraq. The U.S. government, the Obama administration, has said that they're sending 300 advisors into Iraq. He said that he will consider bombing as he determines whether they're appropriate targets. And the simple fact is what we're seeing in Iraq today is purely the result of U.S. militarism and U.S. intervention.
Demonstrators said U.S. military involvement of any sort should not be an option in dealing with the ISIL insurgents. A similar protest rally was held in Los Angeles, California. Several veterans of the Iraq War also took part in that rally to try to expose why the conflict started.
No new war is the message coming from protesters in downtown Los Angeles. They've gathered for a nationwide emergency rally to build public support for the anti-war movement.
Protesters say the anti-war movement has come too far to allow the U.S. government to escalate military action in Iraq.
There's going to be more soldiers dying and more Iraqis dying for a place that we absolutely should not be.
Mike Preisner is with Answer Los Angeles. Preisner served in Iraq during the first conflict before joining the anti-war movement.
The one thing that we really held on to and the one thing that kept us going was believing that we were there to bring the Iraqi people a better life. Today, looking at Iraq, this is the life that we brought to the Iraqi people. This is the aftermath of the war that we sacrificed for, believing it was going to be a good thing.
Preisner says President Barack Obama's decision to send so-called military advisors into Iraq is a similar tactic that was used in Vietnam. Protesters say it's clear that the U.S. government is not listening to the public outcry against more wars.
I guess money talks more than people do. So we may have 1 million people saying no, but they have 10 big investors saying yes. So I guess we're going back.
Protesters say demonstrations against a U.S. war on Syria helped to prevent a full invasion. They're now concerned that any escalation in Iraq will also be used as a backdoor into Syria.
We just have to stop this cycle right away and say, no more war. We need money for jobs right here. There are low-wage workers fighting for $15 an hour in a union, fast food workers. We need to make sure that people get a livable wage, not fight and kill innocent people overseas.
John Parker with the International Action Center says if the cycle is not stopped, then the U.S. will continue to disrupt peace and be responsible for the deaths of countless more lives.
With, like a flashback to the 90s. We can just put on some old Bill Hicks records, turn on the TV and see the Bush crime family as they were all this last week as Poppy Bush turned 90 and parachuted out of a plane. And we can also watch another war in Iraq. Because as you noted earlier this week on Twitter, James, this is the real meaning of mission accomplished. Let's just get the baseline intro from CBS News as Islamist militant group ISIS takes hold of Iraq. President Obama said on Friday the 13th that the mounting violence in Iraq should be a wake-up call for Iraq's leaders, committing the U.S. to help halt the advance of Islamist extremists, but saying that an ultimate resolution must come from Iraq's political leaders. In January, this group, now known as ISIS, even though their actual acronym should be ISIL, ISIS has much more kind of mythical weight to it. In January, they captured Fallujah, the regional hub just 40 miles west of Baghdad, raising fears of an incursion into the Iraqi capital. The fighting took another dramatic turn this past week when ISIS militants seized Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, and the heart of the Kurdish community in northern Iraq. James, some of the latest just coming in this day today, as I come to you, June 18th. They've attacked Iraq's largest oil refinery, which, again, should cause question of who these attacks really benefit. But let's break it down with an article posted to Global Research that notes the U.S. was trained, or rather, the U.S. trained ISIS, I should say, at a secret Jordan base. Members of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS, were trained in 2012 by U.S. instructors working at a secret base in Jordan, according to informed Jordanian officials. The officials said dozens of ISIS members were trained at the time as part of covert aid to the insurgents targeting the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The officials said the training was not meant to be used for any future campaign in Iraq, but the Jordanian officials also said ISIS members who received U.S. training to fight in Syria were first vetted for any links to extremist groups like Iraq. James, please help us break down this latest round of seemingly never-ending, decades-long war of aggression.
Well, that's exactly what this is about. It's about constant destabilization. And what I mean by this is the real mission accomplished is that this was the long-term plan of course, the PNAC crew, and even going back well before them, going back to the Oded Yunom plan. Israel has had Iraq in its crosshairs for a very long time, wanting to break it up, wanting to break up all of the different parts of the region into warring factions. And as we see the possibility of Iraq being split in an official sense now between Kurds, Shiites, and Sunnis, I think we are seeing the beginnings of the possibility of that. So some huge shifts that are taking place on the geopolitical table right now. I'm glad you pointed out that U.S. trained ISIS at Jordan base. I think that's a very important story, and that goes back to a story that Boiling Frogs Post broke back in November, December of 2011, and I actually did an interview at that time with an insider whistleblower who was talking about U.S. training at that Jordan military base. We got a lot of flack for that at the time. Oh, you're just making this up. Why should we trust you? It was confirmed a year later in the alt media, 2 years later in the MSM, even the Guardian and papers like that were talking about it. And now it comes out, oh yeah, they were training ISIS as well. So very important little thread of that story right there. And of course, it's being framed in a lot of the media that's reporting on it as blowback. Oh, it's blowback. No, it's not blowback. It's the U.S. training these terrorists to be terrorists. That's exactly what the U.S. is doing. That's what they've done for a very long time. Let's not sugarcoat it or put a candy floss over it. Now, what I think is really happening here, in addition to the breakup of Iraq, we're seeing some huge swings on the geopolitical table, and potentially ones with very large ramifications, including the fact that the U.S. and Iran are collaborating at the table right now because both of them do not want ISIS to reach Baghdad or to overthrow the Iraqi government altogether. Obviously, the Shiites in Iran have a vested interest in making sure that the Wahhabist Sunni terrorists don't overrun the country, and the U.S., at least nominally, has to be on their side in all of this, although Iran should be very careful about this, because if they don't understand that the U.S. is funding the Sunni terrorists as well, then they're just a bunch of dum-dums. But now we also have Saudi Arabia, of course, which is quite explicitly helping to fund and train ISIS, and are Wahhabists themselves. They obviously are tacitly and in some respects openly supporting ISIS, and thus are against the official U.S. policy. Yet another wedge between the U.S. and Saudis, which, as Saudi begins to develop its relations with China, I mean, this is becoming a very important shift that's going on right now, and some people are talking about this as the end of the petrodollar. I don't know if it's the end, but it might be the beginning of the end, and that's going to be a very long process. In fact, the U.S. and Saudis just signed another $60 billion arms contract, their largest ever, so I'm not sure that wedge is going to be driven home quite yet, but it is forming, and that's extremely significant. So a lot is on the table right now, and of course this also brings in the possibility that we will see that Syrian intervention after all, because hey, ISIS was operating from there as well. So if you're going to send in troops anywhere, you might as well send them to Syria as well. So a lot is happening right now. We're going to have to keep our eyes on this story and follow the developments, because I think this is going to turn on a dime.
Hey, excuse me, hey, Adam Kokesh.
Adam, what do you do?
Fallujah veteran. I do an independent podcast and a YouTube channel called Adam vs. the Man. I just want to ask you about foreign policy real quick. Would you describe yourself as an interventionist?
I describe myself as an American.
Well, you believe in a foreign policy that is funded by taxation, correct?
Foreign policy funded by taxation.
Yeah.
Well, the government is funded by taxation, and the government makes the foreign policy.
Right. So if
have I got that wrong?
No, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
So if the foreign policy that you suggest is supposed to increase freedom, but it costs money that's taken from the taxpayers by force, isn't that an infringement on our freedom? Isn't that a policy that makes us less free, especially when it makes enemies, as I learned in Fallujah?
When were you in Fallujah?
2004.
Is that right? Which, April or November?
The first battle, yeah, the smaller one, the siege.
So, if we don't want taxation, we need to change the people we elect,
right?
Who create our taxes.
Well, we need to stop demanding the government solve problems all over the world, right?
Well, I don't think we try to solve problems all over the world, do we?
Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, now Ukraine, foreign aid, all those things are working on solving problems all over the world, right?
Well, I think the primary purpose of government is to protect the American people, right? You buying that?
Sure.
Yeah. So how would you do it?
Well, I would start by demanding that they stop stealing from us in the form of taxation.
Then I recommend you elect a new Congress, which is what I spoke to this morning. You were there, right?
Yes, sir. All right, thank you, Colonel.
Guys, have a good evening. Colonel, would you say the primary goal of government?
Okay, perfect. I see what it says.
Freedoms, or to protect the rights of the American people?
Actually, the oath that they all take is the same as I took, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So not to protect the people, but to protect their rights.
Support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America.
Thank you.
How'd that go, Anthony?
That was great, man. Great job. Excellent questions. And I'm not sure, how did he actually end that? Was it more of a it was Congress. Voting is always the answer, no matter how many times we expose that voting doesn't work, that the system is corrupt to the core. Any way you look at it, vote. Just keep voting and play the game. So
Oliver North, people, if you don't like it, you can beg or vote for your freedoms and hope that the government will stop stealing from you to pay for all of his crazy interventionist ideas.
Absolutely.
Iraq is descending into chaos, but not for the reasons you're being fed by the politicians and the mainstream media. In June of 2014, the world watched in shock as an Islamic militant group operating under the name of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, took control of Mosul, Baiji, and Tikrit and began pushing south to Baghdad. Fallujah has been under their control since January. Iraqi military and police put up very little resistance in spite of the fact that they greatly outnumbered the militants. Most fled their posts and left their uniforms and weapons behind. Those who didn't were killed. ISIS, whose stated goal is to erase the border between Syria and Iraq, to establish an Islamic caliphate encompassing both countries, and to impose Sharia law, already holds vast swaths of territory, and they are rapidly gaining ground. How did this happen? That's an extremely important question. How you answer it will determine what comes next, not just in Iraq. That's why the media spin doctors and politicians are out in force, attempting to rewrite history and turning reality completely on its head in the process. For example, we have people insisting that this is happening because the US and NATO failed to intervene in Syria. Well, that's a convenient answer, isn't it? The US and NATO have been actively working to topple Assad by arming and funding the Syrian rebels since at least 2011. This has developed into a bloody civil war which has attracted jihadists from all over the world. It has also created a vacuum of power which enabled groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Nusra to organize and establish physical strongholds. The US claims to only be arming the moderate rebels. However, the leadership of the Free Syrian Army, aka the FSA, has stated that they regularly carry out joint operations with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Up until recently, ISIS was a branch of Al-Qaeda. In February of this year, Al-Qaeda's official leadership publicly disavowed ISIS due to their brutal tactics. That's why ISIS is referred to as a splinter group. Furthermore, we know for a fact that the majority of the weapons and funding from the US and its allies are ending up in the hands of jihadists. And US officials have been aware of this since 2012. But don't take my word for it. Go read this article from the New York Times yourself. Do the math, folks. ISIS would have never gotten a foothold in Syria if the US hadn't weakened the Syrian government. And the weapons that they're using right now were most likely paid for with your tax dollars. But wait, this isn't just about Syria, is it? It's also about Iraq. Which brings us to the other deranged narrative that's being promoted right now. That this chaos is unfolding because the US military withdrew prematurely in 2011. You see, Iraq is in ruins and unable to defend itself because the US military left the party too early. It's not because the Bush administration and the mainstream media convinced the public that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and was planning to use them. No, and it's not because the US invaded Iraq under these false pretenses, disbanding the Iraqi army and police and reducing the country to rubble in an attempt to put down the resulting insurgency. No, it's because 8 years of military occupation wasn't enough. Those who fought there, it's a punch in the gut to see your sacrifice was for nothing. But the occupation of Iraq was never going to end well. And the Bush administration knew that it wouldn't. But don't take my word for it. Let's take a look at this clip, Dick Cheney, from 1994.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad? No. Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west, part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north you've got the Kurds, and the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take down Iraq.
That was very astute, Dick. You accurately predicted the mess that you were going to help create in 2003. I would even venture to say that your predictions were more accurate than those who warned against this adventure. I'm impressed. Now you'll notice that the talking heads of the left and the right are both trying to frame this crisis as the fault of the other side. They're both right. Both sides of the aisle have blood on their hands, and this goes way beyond Bush and Obama. The United States has been tinkering in Iraq for a long, long time. In fact, it was the CIA that put Saddam in power in 1963. Don't take my word for it. Go read this article from the New York Times. The US government also backed Saddam in 1980 when he launched a war of aggression against Iran, even though they knew he was using chemical weapons. But again, don't take my word for it. Go read this article by Foreign Policy magazine. Fast forward to 1990. Saddam Hussein was embroiled with Kuwait over oil prices and borders, and he was preparing to take action. Given America's support in the war against Iran, Saddam had no reason to believe that Kuwait would be any different. But just to be sure, he decided to consult with Washington first. On July 25th of 1990, U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, met with Saddam Hussein. In the meeting, Saddam described his case against Kuwait and told Glaspie that he viewed their activities as an act of military aggression. Glaspie responded by saying, quote, "We have no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait." And she reinforced this by saying, "This issue is not associated with America." Naturally, Saddam interpreted this as a green light. And 8 days later, he invaded. Later, when questioned in hearings, Glaspie claimed that though this quote was accurate, she had followed it up by insisting that Iraq settle its dispute nonviolently.
Did you say we have no opinion on the Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait?
Yes, that was one part of my sentence. The other part of my sentence was, but we insist that you settle your disputes with Kuwait non-violently.
However, that's not what shows up in the transcripts of the conversation released by the New York Times. According to the transcript, what she actually said was, "All that we hope is that these issues are solved quickly." But maybe this was just an innocent diplomatic blunder, right? Well, not quite. As soon as Saddam entered Kuwait, the US government launched a very interesting propaganda campaign to build up public support for a war. They claimed that Iraqi troops were slaughtering little babies by throwing them out of their incubators in hospitals. And they brought in teary-eyed witnesses who testified to having seen the massacre.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers coming to the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
I myself buried 40 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
Kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
Just one little problem. The entire event was fabricated. It never happened. This woman who presented herself as a witness was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And her testimony was part of a public relations campaign organized by a company called Hill and Knowlton. Once public support for the war was strong, the incubator story was dropped, never mentioned again. The U.S. invaded Iraq in 1991. During that war, the U.S. military utilized approximately 640,000 pounds of depleted uranium ammunition. Iraq was decimated, but the U.S. left Saddam in power. The war didn't ever really end, though. The U.S. kept Iraq under a draconian sanctions regime that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children. Clinton kept those sanctions in place for the entire duration of his presidency, and they knew what was happening.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it? I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
You know how they say that those who don't know history are destined to repeat it? That's really not an exaggeration. Fast forward to 2003, and the Kuwait incubator story was swapped out for stories of mobile missile silos and yellow cake uranium. And when it turned out that those weapons of mass destruction didn't exist, they acted like it was no big deal. Then of course came Obama, riding in on promises of hope and change. But we saw how Obama toppled Libya in 2011, leaving that nation in utter chaos. We've seen how he's armed and funded the Syrian rebels in an attempt to bring down Assad. Obama is operating from the same playbook. And yes, there is a playbook.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Fortunately, the future is not set in stone. We can influence the outcome, and we already are. We proved that in 2013 when the left and the right dropped their petty bickering and unified against Obama's proposal to use airstrikes against Assad. The pattern of deceit is the same, but this time the people didn't fall for it. The fact that we had the UN investigator Carla Del Ponte come out and say that the Syrian rebels were behind the sarin gas attacks helped. The fact that Putin short-circuited the US diplomatically helped. But the determining factor was the popular resistance, particularly the signs of discontent from within the military. See, the ruling class is very hesitant to take a nation to war. The people and the military strongly oppose it. That's why the first casualty of war is always the truth. What's going on right now in Iraq is horrific. The ISS is already committing atrocities against civilians on a massive scale.
Inexplicably, the Obama administration did not provide Iraq with immediate air support, even after the fall of Mosul.
I say inexplicably not because I support airstrikes, but because on June 12th, the U.S. military conducted its second drone strike this month in Pakistan. Why would Obama refuse to act in Iraq when civilians are being massacred, while employing drones in Pakistan without hesitation?
I'll tell you why. Because the outrage over the atrocities that the ISS is committing may be enough to provide the U.S. government with a backdoor into Syria. You see, it turns out that Obama is considering airstrikes, but not just in Iraq. He wants to extend those strikes into Syria as well. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? Once the U.S. military is able to freely conduct operations in Syrian territory, getting the regime change that they want will be much, much easier. It's the classic formula: problem, reaction, solution. They created the problem, they're letting the public react and build up outrage, and then they're going to propose a solution which will sow the seeds for another generation of conflicts. To short-circuit this pattern, the public needs to come to terms with the cold, hard truth.
No matter what the U.S. does at this point, and no matter how long they stay, there is no happy ending to this story. The chaos that we're seeing in this region is the direct result of half a century of U.S. military interventions and covert operations in the Middle East. It's time to acknowledge that bombing for peace doesn't work. Regime change for stability doesn't work. And you can't fix a mistake by repeating it over and over and over. If the U.S. honestly wants to stop the spread of Islamic terrorism, then they should stop funding and arming jihadists in Syria. That would be a good starting point, don't you think? If you want to keep informed about what's going on in the world, go to our website, scgnews.com, and sign up for email.
Anti-American, come forward, American Constitution. 1913, up in the system. Devalue dollar, hyperinflation, the Federal Reserve, controlled by Lucifer. He can see you lying in your eye. Bye. You know can hide from Judge Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. No